Good morning, everyone.
Good morning. Here we are. We made
Once
it.
again.
Welcome to Goddess Matters on Journey to the Goddess TV. I am back this week with my co-hostess to the mostest, Dr. Andrea Slaminski. Hello, Dr. Andrea.
Hello, Dr. A, Dr. A squared. I
And
don't know
today
why that tickles me so much. It just does.
it's
Uh,
fun.
it-
We have to laugh. We have to laugh when we're talking about very serious subjects.
yes, like
Um,
ourselves, right? Yeah.
Today we're joined by Dr. Megan Rose. Hello, Dr. Megan Rose.
Howdy.
Good morning.
Good
Good
morning.
morning. We're lucky to have her again. She's graced Journey to the Goddess TV a couple of times in the past. I'll link some episodes to that. And we're going to do a deeper dive into her research today. Dr. Megan Rose is a transpersonal psychologist, a pagan scholar, and an eco-spiritual minister. So we're really lucky to have her today to dive into a for some, what might be an unusual topic. For others, it might stir some kind of resonance inside of them. For others, it might just simply pique some curiosity. So let's dive in. And oh, one other thing I want to say is that she's published a book on her work as well. It's called Spirit Marriage. And there will be a link to that in the YouTube show notes as well. So go and purchase that. And if you like this video today, please like, please share, please leave a comment, and please subscribe to the channel. And if you have any specific comments for Dr. Megan Rose, we will pass that on to her. Okay, so with that beginning, let's just dive right in and why don't we just start with some of your research? And actually, before we even jump into the research, or maybe in addition to it, how did you get into this topic? How did it
Great
find you?
question. Yeah, such a great question. Over the years, I've asked, myself, when was that moment? When was that moment that I sort of knew that there was this other than human contact? And as I've looked back over my life, I really had to sort of um, accept the fact that it has been something that I have been walking with my whole life. And that's primarily because I was raised in the Pentecostal Christian tradition, and people that know anything about Pentecostalism, it's all about the Holy Spirit, which is this more than human face. Some kind call it the Holy Spirit, the the feminine face of God in those um, Christian traditions. They might not see it that way, but in any event, this sense of this numinous presence in my life, co-walking with me, that sometimes expressed as me, because in Pentecostalism you are filled with the Holy Spirit and you speak with the voice of the Holy Spirit, and there's laying on of hands and dancing in the Spirit. There's all these ecstatic manifestations when you are indwelled with this other than human consciousness. And so it really just, I kind of walked in that way, in that I was really initiated at a really early age into being spirit filled. Over the years, as I grew as a religious studies scholar, and I began to wear more than just the hat of Pentecostal Christianity, but really began to look at world religion, and through my seminary journey, I began to look at this phenomena through a variety of different lenses and practices transculturally. And what became really noteworthy to me was that people not only could channel, right, or if it be filled with these other than human presences, but they could create these deep devotional bonded relationships with them. And
Mm.
whether they understood those presences to be gods and goddesses, or um, daimons, or spirits of the land, sea, and air, or a whole host of other category, really depended on their cultural specificity, where they were, what the tradition was that they were sitting in, and also what they were being tapped by the spirit. what spirits were sort of ringing their doorbell. And so spirit marriage really arose out of that lifelong curiosity that I had around humans and spirit-filled connections. And so that's really why I went very specific in spirit marriage, to look at this specific phenomena across the globe around people who have bonded relationships, or what I call marriage. I use the term marriage just because it's sort of the most readily accessible word that we have for what the level of commitment is in a lot of these bonded relationships. But it's called a variety of different things depending on the culture.
Mm.
And then, part of that, and at the tail end of the book, and my current research is on this idea that we don't necessarily have to have a spirit that is what we would consider to be external to us, like a god or a goddess, but we all have an innate divine self that we can arise as, which is this process of the divine within, or in theos, the divine that lives within us, that we can have this committed, loving, bonded relationship with.
Wow.
Pause there, because that's a
Yeah,
lot.
yeah, I know. Just and take that in. I love that. That's a beautiful summary of your work. Everyone at home, I've read her book at least twice now. So I love the way that you really encompass what is really a complicated and diverse topic in just a really easy to digest way. Andrea, do you have any questions? I know that Dr. Megan Rose's work is new for you.
Yeah, I don't have your book, but I'm going to be purchasing it because I think this is fascinating. I went back and watched the clip that you had sent us to reference your work from a YouTube post that you had. And at first I wasn't quite sure when Annalisa was trying to tell me about your work and the focus of spirit marriage, and I wasn't quite sure. And then after listening to the YouTube show and then looking a little bit more deeply into what you do, I think this is so fascinating because to me, of course, right? Of course, of course, there's such a thing, because I think of what you had just discussed, of the broad range of how people feel that they have contact, either directly or interpsychically or through dreams or through inspiration, with divine energies, with sacred energies, with the energies of, someone might be connected to a particular forest or a particular place, or someone might be connected, like you had said, to a particular religious tradition. And especially when you had mentioned the Loa, the tradition of the Loa in Voodoo, which interested me very much when we were doing our dissertation and our work at Pacifica, and the experience with ancestors and the ability to have dialogue with and relationship with spiritual beings, I guess, for a lack of a greater term, while we're here. And then looking at it in terms of how one then develops a particular relationship and what that leads to in terms of what we would call marriage or partnership or energetic partnership across the realms. And so from the smallest inkling of feeling the presence of a departed loved one to feeling the direct influence of a divine energy, I was like, oh, this, of course. It's just fascinating to me. I can't wait to read the book.
Yeah, I mean, I think that your response is not uncommon. I think a lot of people, and maybe it's the limitation of the label of the book, but I also really wanted to normalize this conversation. And so, I didn't give it a more maybe psychological label, because I wanted the conversation to arise. When I started this research 20 some odd years ago, it happened because I was having my own phenomenological experience of a spirit coming and wanting to marry me. And because that I had gone to seminary and studied comparative religion and knew about this, the provenance of this in other cultures, I didn't just immediately dismiss it as, some sort of gestalt, although I looked through those, lenses and asked those questions as well. But I really wanted to approach this with all the seriousness that a scholar of comparative religion would. And to do that, we really have to step into this framework of understanding that conversations with other than humans are a normal part of human experience, albeit maybe an expanded part of our capacity as humans to have these conversations. And that throughout, when I began to look at the history of it, I mean, it's been there in, some of the very first recorded human documents, from all the way back into Acadia and Sumeria. And so the idea that it has been happening, I think, looking through the story of the Virgin Mary, or as you mentioned, the African traditional religions, it's not a question of has it been happening, it's if it's still happening, why. And that was really the journey that I went on in the research, was to understand why is it still happening, who is having these contacted experiences, and to what end and to what purpose. And the answer to that is for a variety of purposes. There is no one right and only way to go about a spirit marriage, to embody a spirit marriage. And the outcomes are as diverse as humanity is.
Yeah. I think it's just interesting because when I think about all of the baggage that comes with the term marriage, right? Especially in Western culture. And since I'm in the middle of a dissolving one, it puts me in a particularly interesting position. But that I look at sort of the whole Judeo-Christian, even Abrahamic, even Islamic somewhat traditions, and their exclusion of their, how can I say this, their belief that to work with spirits, to acknowledge other worldly spirits, that is something that shouldn't be done, that is something outside of the divine, that is right. And so I think in some ways, in at least, I guess I can speak to American culture because this is where I grew up and this is where I live. It has made it sort of it has cast it into the darkness. It has made it witchcraft. It has made it Satanism. It has made it something outside of the canon of the church, that it's evil, that it's right. And to work with or try to contact like other worldly entities. And so I wonder if maybe some of the resistance to these ideas, right? Because people think, well, marriage, well, how are you married? How can you be married or have a partner in the real world? And you had discussed this a little bit, and be married to a spirit. How does that work? How does all this, right? And you go into that in details about how, and it sort of starts to break down the limiting structures of how, I don't know, Judeo-Christian culture has shut down this whole side of relationship with the divine.
Yeah. Yeah. Just to respond to that, and then I want to, make sure that we loop Annalisa in. Jump in at any time, Annalisa.
No, it's okay. I'm good.
But I mean, to your point, Andrea, about not having contact with spirits, let me be clear. Christianity, let's just talk about Christianity, it has plenty of contact with spirits. They talk to the saints, they talk to the angels, they have a three gods, right? It's not a monotheistic tradition. There's God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. And the Mother Mary. There is a long tradition of the brides of Christ, which are nuns that marry Jesus, they take vows, they wear rings, they, the church generally believes that in Catholicism, the priests marry the church. So there is this, it's just that they're sanctioned spirits, right? These are spirits within the confines of that tradition, and that is very much about for lack of a better term, control. It's very much about keeping people within a particular faith tradition, keeping people within specific thought forms and specific practices that are sanctioned, that, gets into a whole socio-religio-political conversation that we won't go into today. But that's, that is essentially the underpinnings of this. And one of the things that I like to underscore with spirit marriage, particularly when you're stepping into a relationship with beings that are not within either your culturally sanctioned tradition, like a Christianity or one of these more monotheistic kinds of religion, is that you're stepping into a sense of agency and sovereignty of your own spiritual path.
Yeah.
And that is very threatening to organized religion. And it's why, many of the various faiths, including, many of the pagan faiths, the fairy faith, these traditions were eradicated, right? Because that they often taught a sense of agency, or the idea of a personal relationship with Jesus, right, was sort of supplanted for personal relationships with other what in the South Asian traditions called the Ishta, or the chosen deity, right? And so one's Ishta Devi or Metet or holy guardian angel, these relationships we can hold with our deity that is our chosen deity. That might be because the deity chose us. It might be because we chose the deity. There's sort of a potato-potato relationship there that really opens up, and to the point of decoding monogamy and marriage in the West. Yes, absolutely. There is a way in which, we live with these blinders on in the West that says marriage looks like this, or relationship looks like this, and a normal marriage or a normal relationship should be this very limiting scope. And if you open that up and look at relationship and marriage across history and across culture, it's just not that limited.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I would like us to get into how somebody can recognize that they're being tapped on the shoulder, as you said, by a spirit. But before we do that, I think it might be helpful to kind of further ground the history of spirit marriage, as as you call it, in like a specific tradition, like you did in that link that you sent us. And Dr. Lisa Skura, one of our colleagues, has said that she's studying Celtic myth and wondering about Druidism. And I know that you mentioned that in that clip. So maybe we can discuss spirit marriage in a historical context in that way, before bringing it into the present.
Sure. Yeah. So, one of the, when I was doing this sort of spirit marriage transcultural analysis and looking at as many of the different traditions that I could find, one of the examples that, really resonated with my own, because I am an initiated Druid, and through the Anglesey Druid Order in Wales, and have practiced a form of the Celtic fairy faith for the sort of American migration of the Celtic fairy faith for about almost 20 years now. In any event, to speak in the Druid tradition, there is a practice where the king of the tribe or the particular area would marry the goddess Sovereignty, who was, and through that marriage she would confer to him the kingship. So there was this sense of, he became a king because that he married, and there is echoes of the Hyros Gamos in that ritual that we have literature for, that that demonstrates, whether it was a sort of an actual, the king would come together with the high priestess, and who was being aspected or indwelled by the goddess of sovereignty, and then through their union, the kingship was conferred, or whether it was done ritually, or through some sort of sexual ritual. We don't really know, because a lot of these the extant texts are in kind of a twilight language, but we can guess that there is an aspect of spirit marriage, that's being offered in these stories that we have from both the Celtic tradition, and you see that echoed in the South Asian traditions as well, with the yogini. And there are texts, and I think it's Briganti's work, where she talks about the to step into kingship or leadership of a tribe. The man would, usually it's a man, would marry the yogini, and she would confer to him the power to then rule a particular people or a particular area. And these are early, I think, generally thought to be pre-Vedic traditions, so the sort of indigenous tribal traditions of South Asia. You see it again and again and again throughout different cultures, this idea that a leader will step into a bonded relationship, a committed relationship, and that commitment then confers power, but also responsibility, right? Responsibility to tend that particular land, because they're all often the goddess of sovereignty in the Celtic traditions, which, I mean, I could go down a whole rabbit hole of, there is no one monolithic Celtic tradition. You look at the Irish, you look at the Welsh, you look at the Scottish. I mean, there's such variety just within those traditions. But in general, there's this idea that the sovereign of the land, be it male or female, steps into a bonded relationship with the sovereign of the bioregion that they're in, and that power and responsibility is conferred, and that ensures, it's thought to ensure the health of the land, the health of the people, the health of the animals, the crops. All of that is part of this dynamic relationship that is very much infused and informed by the vitalism, the vitality, the eros energy of the human, and the vitalism within the land.
And what's interesting about that is the commonality, I think, of it being a male ruler ritually or symbolically uniting with a feminine force, a feminine energy, and that the energy is coming from the feminine aspect through the male to the land, the community, etc. I think that's interesting and worth noting.
I think it's worth noting, in so much as that is been living under, the thousands of years of patriarchy that we live. That's what's recorded mostly in the text. But certainly we have stories of Queen Maeve of Connacht. We have, the the many different tribal leaders that were female, throughout the Celtic traditions, and I wouldn't rule that out as one of their initiatory, perhaps inner traditions that is not necessarily gotten recorded. I mean, the Celts didn't write a lot of stuff down, so in that frame, and so what gets recorded is not
Yeah,
at all the extent of what was actually practiced.
right, 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 of course.
Boudica, that's the Iceni tribal leader that I was, so we have these strong female leaders that, very well may have had this as part of the twilight practices.
Right. Right. I have some very specific thoughts on Mesopotamia, but I don't want I don't want to go down that route. I think that's something you and I can discuss later. Um, but I wonder, before we go into the how can one recognize the spirit is calling it, before we do that, Andrea, do you have any more questions in this kind of historic?
No, this is great. Awesome.
Okay. So yeah, I think, like, for someone like me, I can't speak for you, Andrea, but for someone like me who does communicate with these otherworldly beings, but would never, I wouldn't, I'm not even sure I would recognize anything within those relationships that would hearken to a let's be bonded in some way. There's sometimes I feel a fire, a calling to understand, a yearning to know, but I don't. So I want to know how someone would even recognize that there's a union, a calling for union.
It's a really good question. It's a valid um insight around the limitation of the word marriage, right? Because people hear marriage, they hear bond, and they think, oh, there we go. That's it. My one and only for the rest of my life. Right?
Yeah, right.
That's not, by and large, that's not how marriage works for most folks, at least here in the West anymore. And certainly some of these traditions, if you step into a bonded, committed relationship with one of these beings, it might need to be for the life because that there are certain vows that you take and or ways in which your nervous system is rewired. Orion Foxwood talks about this quite a bit in his fairy marriage. Um, but I want to just pause and say that not everybody needs to be bonded to a spirit. Not everybody needs to have a spirit marriage, in the sense, in so much as we understand these beings to be external to us, right?
Mhm.
We all, however, have the innate birthright of our own divine self. Each and every one of us has a rarefied aspect of us, call it, whether you want to look at it through a Jungian lens or, a archetypal lens. We all have this divine self. There's so many languages and so many words for it, right? The unique self, the holy guardian angel. I've rattled off a few already. That we absolutely have a opportunity to step into a relationship with, and that being is always trying to ring our doorbell, get our attention, and and our understanding of that divine self might shift and change.
Mm.
So even in this, when I did my research, I noticed that the Matet and the Ishta Devi wasn't necessarily fixed for all of eternity with you. It might, as you grow and evolve, it might shift. Its face might shift and change, and it's not that the through line, if you think about it as like the thread of that being might stay the same, but the pearls, the identity strung along it might evolve and change. And so that is, just to start from that place, we all have that. And then these other beings, these other than us, other than human, other than us beings, I like to ground it in like human relationship. Like human relationships, we have a variety of different ways in which we constellate our human relationships, right? Sometimes we have great passion with someone for a while and we bond to them and we have a really close relationship, whether it's sexual or other, and then that relationship might shift and dissolve and move on. And bonded relationships to spirits can very much look like that as well. We might fall in love with a deity and be like, all in. I'm all in with Mary Magdalene. And like I'm Mary and we are tight, and she in a dynamic bonded relationship with that being, whether we're aspecting it or whether we're just in devotional relationship with it, might take up a number of years in our life. And then the relationship might not sour, but just soften, and another being or deity might come in. And sometimes we have deities that introduce us or beings that introduce us to other beings. And so there's a way in which it's not dissimilar from spirit communication, right? In which we're maybe channeling or in a devotional relationship with. The spirit marriages, as I've researched them, tend to have a more formalized commitment that arises because either the human or the spirit want that or need that, or it seems to be indicated. And sometimes, if you recall in my book, sometimes that was because somebody in your community was like, I need you to step into this role for this community, and to do that you need to bond. Like, I'm thinking of the story of Madrone. Remember the West African shrine keeper from the Dagara tradition of Burkina Faso, and her community came to her and said, we need you to marry Tingan. We need you to marry, because we need you to hold this for the community, because we don't have a Tingan soap, we don't have a Tingan seer within this community, and we need you to be able to mediate his energy for the community. And so she said yes. That was kind of an arranged marriage, right? And then you have, on the other spectrum, you have Carolyn Kenner, who is married to a variety of different spirits that, through her work as a witch doctor and a shaman, these spirits came and asked her for marriage in visionary states, right? And then you have the example of Orion Foxwood, who just had this long-term relationship, an LTR, with his fairy beloved, and then his priestess, Dolores Ashcroft Nowicki, right, reappeared to her and said, I want to marry Orion. And she came out to Orion, she came out of that trance and said, Orion, you need to marry this being. And Orion's like, how do I even do that? So there's so many different ways that they get our attention and ring our doorbell. And then there's other spirits in my, community of people that I support, who they're like, I'm in love with Isis. I want to devote myself to her.
Right.
Right. And that becomes a marriage, and people will, sometimes create their own marriage vows, marriage commitment ceremonies, right?
Right.
To that relationship. So sometimes the community, sometimes the individual, sometimes the spirit. It just, it really, like I said earlier, there is no one right and only way that these relationships evolve and emerge.
You also describe in your book that, okay, because I'm thinking about this continuity of this, of responsibility, how responsibility seems to be a common thread in many of these spirit marriage unions, whether that be responsibility to the community or responsibility with the energy, or maybe responsibility to the divine self. And then you have another thread in your book where you talk about, it's been a little while since I read it, but there's this ecological aspect, or this way that when we awaken to our divine self, uh, in the variety of ways that we can do sacred union, that there's a healing, an ecological healing that occurs, which also feels like a responsibility.
Yeah, I mean, there can be. I won't say that eco consciousness and eco spiritual awareness is always a byproduct of these relationships, because that some of these deities don't necessarily bring that with them. Um, but and by bring that with them, I mean, if you're in a bonded relationship with, say, a deity that is associated primarily with the cosmos, there might be more of this cosmic consciousness, but less of a earth, or an ecological consciousness. But certainly for myself, there was a way in which, I was the inquiry of who the spirit was that was sort of tapping my shoulder. Because sometimes these spirits don't initially present as, I am Mercury, I want to have a relationship with you. Sometimes it's like you get, like a black cat just constantly running across your path, and you're like, who, Freya, is that you? Or, you guys gotta sort of go through your lexicon of animal associations with the different spirits and deities, and Hecate, is that you? Bast, is that you? And you're sort of looking to see. In my experience, the spirit that contacted me often manifest in either dreams or visionary states or synchronicity, because I was just talking about synchronicity, um, through plant form,
Mm.
through trees, through sometimes animal form, and that to me was very ecologically rooted and ecologically oriented, and that is what sort of opened the roads for me to step into my and to sort of reclaim my ancestral roots as, you know, someone whose family came out of, you know, the British Isles and made the migration to the US, and that's what sort of led me back through my southern roots and then back into druidry and fairy seership, the fairy faith,
Mm.
which is very ecologically grounded and oriented, right?
Yes. Yes.
I
Andrea.
think that just sparked a question. So thinking about the fairy faith and the faiths that are Celtic and I would say originally grounded in the British Isles, right? And Scotland and Wales and Ireland and that whole area. So with the migration to the US, um, are there indigenous fairies that are different than say the fairies that might be traditional to that European or that British tradition, Scottish, Irish, Welsh tradition? Or
Yeah.
do they just come with the practitioners in that sense? I mean, I know they're not bounded by geography. I understand that, but it just kind of made me think,
Yes, and yeah. So there are, you know, if you look at the indigenous traditions, right? The various indigenous traditions here in the North America, there are ample stories
yeah,
of what we would classify as fairies. They don't call them fairy, but
yeah,
you know, fairy-like beings other than human beings
yeah,
that the indigenous people interacted with, and our ancestors brought with them their spirit bonds,
yeah,
and sometimes they were bound by land, meaning sometimes they were very much associated with with a piece of land, and a soul loss occurred because that the relationship that had been cultivated with the spirits of that particular terroir was broken when our ancestors left, and so much of our soul loss and our soul sickness, right, as transplants here in North America is sometimes arises because that there were these deep connected bonded relationships with places and land and terrain that we don't know if we haven't been, you know, if we haven't made pilgrimage. And I gave a talk at with my partner at Harvard Divinity School a couple of years ago around eco-psychology and pilgrimage. And for those of us that have this sort of, you know, Northern European, British Isles and Ireland ancestry, going back to reconnect and really feel. And I certainly, the first time I went back, to the UK, where like 90% of my ancestry is from, there was just, you know, the delicious shivers like this, particularly when I went to Scotland, because I have a lot of Scottish ancestry. This like almost a reclamation,
yeah,
right, in my blood and bones, that I could feel being back there. And then the sadness, right? The In the Celtic tradition, it's called Hraith, and it's a longing for a land, right? Longing for your place on the land that maybe you even never knew in this
yeah,
lifetime. You haven't even ever known, and so there's this ancestral justification and reconnection, and in some cases, I think, in my cases, I have more esoterically traced this, so I can't document it in my genealogy. But like when I look at my esoteric lineage, it feels like the women in my ancestral line, particularly on my mother's side, were probably married to this same spirit again and again and again. And then when the migration happened for various reasons, those practices were forgotten or left. Or when sometimes when Christianization happens and
Yeah.
people take a new god,
Yeah.
those relationships, those bonds, those commitments don't necessarily die. They're
Mm.
just forgotten. And so many of us that in the 21st century that are leaning back into either ancestral tradition or eco-spiritual or pagan or just other than this sort of homogenized religion of the West, we're surfing these strange tides, is because that we have these connections that we're remembering and reconnecting to in ourselves.
Yeah. Sorry, Andrea, I have a
No,
question
go
to
ahead. Go ahead.
follow up. Okay. Well, let me give myself as an example. So in the case of someone like me, I felt similarly when I went to the many times that I've been to Italy. And it's kind of a long story. I didn't even know that I had Italian heritage for a long time. But the first time I stepped on the soil, it was like my cells woke up. Yeah. And I was like, oh my God, what's wrong? I was supposed to be born here. What happened? And yeah, and so with every visit, there was this, opening and remembering and this longing of return, and it's something that's almost impossible to describe in words. Um, and yet, I don't, and it's not a but, it's an and, you know, there's been this reorientation to Christianity, but I haven't had this longing even despite that cellular remembering from stepping on the land, I haven't had this longing to connect with Roman religion or Etruscan religion, maybe the Greek though. Okay, because I think perhaps the ancestries from the south, where the Greeks colonized, some of those early inhabitants. And so that might explain also my draw to living in Greece and that other opening. I don't Even though there's an at-homeness that I feel when I'm in Greece that I've never felt anywhere else, it's not the same kind of cellular awakening that I had in Italy. I don't know how to describe the difference. They're two feelings of belonging that are equal but different. And so, for whatever reason, I feel more connected to the Greek mythological and sacred history than I do the Italian.
Well, but we're all made up of a variety of different, at least most of us here in the West, a
Right.
variety of different ancestry streams. So it may just be that that one lineage in Italy was what you needed almost as an initiatory, like reconnecting activation, right? And then there are other streams that you will surf.
Right, right. Yeah. That's interesting. Okay. So then what advice would you give to somebody then who feels this longing to reconnect, maybe with any ancestral lineage, because like you said, there are many within all of us. How how might you go about helping them or suggesting they find the right lineage for them? And or maybe the lineage that's calling them is actually through vis-a-vis a spiritual, another world entity,
Yeah.
perhaps, maybe.
Well, I mean, our first spirit contact, other than having this divine self, are our ancestors. So the very first thing that we do, in most of the spiritual traditions that I've studied, is we set up an ancestor altar, right? We set up an altar to our well and bright ancestors, meaning the ancestors that we want to work with, right? Not the ones necessarily that we need healing. They're a different category. We do different stuff for them. But if you're like talking about, I want to really step into dynamic relationship with my and let me just pause and say, ancestral tradition isn't just your blood ancestry. If we're adopted, we have a whole stellium of ancestors, both because you're adopted into the lineage of the family that adopted you, so they're your ancestors. We have ancestors of spirit. If we've initiated into any particular religion or tradition, or we have ancestors of tradition. We have a variety of different ancestors that we can work with. It's not just about your, blood. So I don't want to go nativist on this, with people. But, our ancestors can look a lot of different ways, right? But you set up an altar to them. These are the ancestors that I want to work with. You also have ancestors of place. So the land that you live on, right? And this gets into like native acknowledgements, right? The land that you live on are the people that were there before you. And so, do you know who the people that were there on the land before you? And do you have a relationship with them? And that could look like just finding out about the history of where you are living, finding out about the traditions of the either the cultural traditions, of your historical and ancestral, excuse me, blood ancestors, or of the land that you're living on. So we don't all have to pilgrimage across the world, right, to engage in these reconnective practices. We can start where we're at.
Right. Okay, I think we should, unless Andrea, I feel like you had a question.
No, I'm good. I'm good.
Okay. I think we should also get to your work with entheosis. We touched on it but I think that was something that you wanted to discuss, and I think it's fascinating and really important for us to unpack that for people so that maybe people can actually see how to work with it themselves.
Yeah. Yeah, so, entheosis is this fancy way of saying the divine within. And this idea that we each have a spark of divinity within us is again a transcultural. It shows up across the world religions. That there is this numinous aspect of you that is nested or an expression of the divine. And what you understand that divine to be is can be within the constellation of a particular pantheon of deities, right? So you could say, to borrow from the Greek tradition, my divine self is an expression of Aphrodite, right? And you find that sort of, I mean, there's a variety of ways to sort of diagnose your divine self. It could be looking at your birth chart, your natal chart, to use the astrological lens. You could look at the Enneagram lens. You could there's all these different psychological and psychospiritual frameworks, right, that you can use to explore what flavor of divinity am I. But the bottom line is it's as unique as your fingerprint. So, Annalisa, you and I might both walk with Aphrodite, but how she expresses through you, or to use a more apt metaphor, Mary Magdalene, because you and I both have Magdalene, scholarship.
Yeah.
Done Magdalene scholarship. Your Mary Magdalene and my Mary Magdalene are going to be as unique as you and I. How we express her, she might be the deity that we are in here to move through, But that is also sort of, and I kind of categorize her as a type of Christian Aphrodite, right, or Christian Aphrodite. Right, she's got this love goddess, but if you know anything about Aphrodite, she was not just a love goddess. She was fierce and deep and chthonic and amazing. Or Inanna, or Ochun, or Erzuli. Like, there's all these different faces, but the ethos of it, this idea of this powerful love and what love truly is and what love truly does, that flows through you. And the more that you get to know that in yourself, you then look at, okay, well, how do then I want to express that in my life, and how can I bring that through as a blessing, right, as a blessing to myself, as a blessing to others, as a blessing to the planet. And that, I think, is sort of like the heart of entheosis. I love to cite this quote from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. because he talks about creating the beloved community, and I cite this I quote this at the very end of my book, where he says to create the beloved community. Right, the beloved community is this place where it's a world that works for everyone, where everyone's needs are met. Right.
Mm,
Um, but to create that is going to take a qualitative change, an inner change in our souls. And I would offer that that's the entheotic process. And then an outer change in our compassionate or
mm,
quantitative change in our compassionate action. And I think that is then the byproduct. That's what happens when we step into dynamic relationship with our divine self and we look at like, how am I expressing Aphrodite or Mercury, or like Hermes Mercury, depending on how, or that sort of energy of the trickster, right, or the disruptor or the innovator, right, because that's all that kind of energy is the flavor of expressing. And when we do that, then it's not just about us. It's not about me. Oh, I'm so rarefied, it's then moves into like, how do we engage? How do we engage each other? How do we engage the planet? And then we get into the eco-spiritual, because then it becomes about the planet, right? And our dynamic relationship with Earth.
right, right. I wonder, this might be too big of a question to unpack right now. So, but looking at the way that Jung would talk about these energies, these archetypal energies, um, and the way that they're maybe imagined in other cultural frameworks, because I think, some people might say that archetypes are psychic energies limited within the mind, whereas, or in that sense, the then next logical conclusion would be products of the imagination, as if the imagination is just producing false things, versus like this idea that these otherworldly intelligences are living, autonomous, sovereign aspects of like maybe one kind of supreme consciousness, maybe that exists both within and without this human psyche. So, given kind of that spectrum of how we might understand archetypes, or deities or otherworldly beings, how would you situate us?
Hmm. I mean, I think that the the reality is, with particularly if I'm just going to put my pagan scholar hat on, right? There is a variety of ways that pagans understand that, right? There's hard polytheism. The gods are absolutely autonomous, independent beings. There's soft polytheism. There's this dynamism. Then there is like, just the pure psychological lens that we can look at it, and all are welcome, right? Because that's the spectrum of belief and practice, and so I don't really care if you think that these are all a product of the psyche, because I'm an animist, and as an eco-spiritual practitioner, that our psyches are nested within the Gaia sphere, right, of the planet, which is its own intelligent being. And so there are layers of and layers of numinous relationship that we're not even aware of, like the intelligence of an ecosystem, like the ocean, the intelligence of a whale. It's a different type of intelligence than human intelligence, but it is nonetheless an intelligence. um and so we could get really hung up on real or not real, but the truth is, are they functional? Do they function in a way for you that gives you more agency, more range, and more integrative practices with yourself, with your community, with the planet?
Mhm.
So I'm more interested in, like, if I understand that I'm in a dynamic relationship with the Aphrodite aspect of myself, that is this loving, powerful, generative energy. I'm in dynamic devotional relationship with it, and maybe she's more than me, maybe she's not. I mean, I think it's sort of the height of human anthropocentrism and arrogance to think that we are like these these, and certainly science is beginning to catch up and illustrate that. And the only other thing that I will say about that is the imaginal realm, particularly through the lens of the Druid, right? The Awen of the imaginal realm that we bring through the other worlds, to look through the Druid lens. It's not just an other world, it's other worlds, and science absolutely upholds this idea of the multiverse, right? The fact that there is more than just this finite reality that we are experiencing right here, right now. And so this idea that we have the ability to be in dynamic relationship with even our own imagination, which Jung would say arises from the collective unconscious and is informed by that collective unconscious, which is much vaster and deeper than what our own little, ego can come up with. I think so. Yeah, 5 minutes or less, big topic, but there's a lot there. And I would point you to Dr. Sharon Blackie's work. If you're not aware of Dr. Blackie's work, she talks a lot about the imaginal realm, as does, I think, Hillman as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I see here that we're closing out on time. And unfortunately, we have to have a hard stop today. So I want to give you the opportunity to say any last words of wisdom for the audience. If there's anything else that you'd like to share that we haven't touched on.
Yeah, I mean, I just think that sometimes just knowing that you have a divine self that you can step into, that you can enact, that you can step into relationship with, is enough to like open that up. And whether you get there through talking to your ancestors, or whether you get there through your own sort of inner inquiry, whether you get to it through synchronicity and science and what I mean, there's so many different ways to step into that conversation, but just know that that conversation is available and there for you. And to step onto that path is in many ways to claim your birthright, to claim your agency and your sovereignty in a world that is competing for your agency, your sovereignty, your attention, constantly competing, constantly hooking you into everybody else's story. So to step into that entheotic relationship is to claim your own story.
Awesome. Wow. I think that's a great way to end this chapter and let people know that you do work with people one-on-one. You also have, I think, a do-it-yourself course that people can also engage with. Obviously, your book. There's many ways that you can work with Dr. Megan Rose. She also teaches at Cherry Hill Seminary. So all of that information is in the YouTube show notes. Thank you so much for coming on today. Thank you, Andrea. I'm really sorry we couldn't go over today, but sometimes we like to.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Megan Rose. It was awesome to talk about this in an expanded way that I think brings potential and clarity and an invitation to so many people.
It's an honor to be here, and we'll come back another time and talk about some more of this.
Exactly. Yes.
We'll unpack the imaginal together.
I love it. Thank you. All right, everybody at home, thank you so much. Please like, please share, please leave a comment, and please subscribe to the channel and check out Dr. Megan Rose's work. There's much more to explore there. So goodbye.